My name is Kendall Bentsen, and I'm an organizer at National Advocates for Pregnant Women. I want to give you a little bit of background about how this webinar topic came to be, and I cannot do that without talking about NAPW's amazing volunteer student organizers. They are working so hard to shape NAPW's student series that you are watching right now. For this series, I have the pleasure of working with our student organizers to break down big reproductive rights issues into bite-sized webinars that help get the word out that repro rights extend beyond the right to have an abortion and, for example, include the right to receive respectful care at birth, which we will be covering today. This webinar is going to be pulling a lot of information from a new resource National Advocates for Pregnant Women has created with Birthrights Bar Association. It's called Birthrights. Birthrights is a free resource for everyday people to defend human rights during labor and birth. We will be sending you a link to the resource in this webinar's follow-up email, so keep an eye out for that. The Birthrights resource was inspired by our work with people who had either experienced or witnessed violations during childbirth. Many folks have reached out to us in the past asking for more information about their own rights during childbirth, and we have heard resounding feedback from people calling for more advocacy tools to identify these rights. We recognize that there is no definitive strategy that works every time in every situation when someone's rights have been violated during childbirth. And we also recognize that some of the strategies or options we will be discussing today come with risks or may not be safe or realistic options for everyone. In particular, people who are already at risk for state control and surveillance, such as low-income people, people of color, transgender and gender nonconforming people, younger parents, older parents, immigrants, people who use drugs, and people with disabilities. They may all face harsher consequences for any resistance to authorities, or may be targeted as a result of being identified as belonging to one or more of these groups. Each individual should weigh their options based on their individual circumstances. Today, we will be providing an overview of the civil and human rights people giving birth have and discuss the limitations of those rights in practice. I want to stress that there is no point in pregnancy in which people lose their civil and human rights, and yet all over the world, people often experience mistreatment and violation of their rights during pregnancy, whether they experience a pregnancy loss, seek to have an abortion, or continue to birth. The reality is particularly present in the United States. In fact, in a June 2019 study focusing on care during labor and delivery, it was reported that 1 in 6 women reported experiencing one or more types of mistreatment, and that reported rates of mistreatment during childbirth were consistently higher for women of color. We also know that doulas and other people providing support to pregnant and birthing people often bear witness to right violations of clients or loved ones. In fact, in a recent survey, 65% of doulas and nurses, such a huge number, 65% of doulas and nurses indicated that they had witnessed providers occasionally or often engage in procedures explicitly against their patients' wishes. Rights violations and mistreatment in childbirth take many different forms, including violations of the right to privacy, bodily autonomy, and medical decision-making. These rights can take place during healthcare through neglect, coercion, verbal abuse, forced interventions, or surgeries. When healthcare providers unlawfully disclose confidential health information to law enforcement or to state agencies that coordinate with law enforcement, and during incarceration when pregnant people are denied access to healthcare. And all this happens in the context of a US healthcare system where extreme disparities persist for Indigenous and Black women in particular, where maternal mortality is rising, where some interventions are overused while other effective options are underused. I'm about to hand it over to Indra, but before I do, I want to stress that we want this to be as interactive as possible. So if you have a question, please post it in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Keep in mind, the Q&A section is different from the chat section, which we will be using to cast our votes. Also, if you have the opportunity, please give a thumbs up to the other people's questions. If you also want to hear the answer to that question, by doing that, you can help us decide which questions to answer during the webinar, as I'll be fielding questions and passing them over to Indra. So, Indra, Would you like to introduce yourself and share a bit about what you do at NAPW before we get started?
Sure. Thanks so much for organizing this, Kendall and student volunteers. I really appreciate your vision in bringing this webinar together. I'm Indra Lusero, staff attorney at National Advocates for Pregnant Women, and also the founder of the Birth Rights Bar Association and Elephant Circle, which is a Colorado-based birth justice organization. And really, through my work at Elephant Circle and the Birth Rights Bar Association, I've developed an expertise in childbirth and the law very broadly, and specifically with regard to rights violations at the time of birth. I actually went to law school specifically to develop this expertise. And so National Advocates for Pregnant Women brought me on to add that expertise to what National Advocates for Pregnant Women usually does, which is really specialize in criminal defense for pregnant folks who are prosecuted for crimes associated with their pregnancy that otherwise wouldn't be crimes. And so I, at National Advocates for Pregnant Women, work on cases where people have been forced either by their providers or by systems into interventions during birth. And this intersects with abortion rights, and it intersects with criminalization, because a lot of times the same logical argument is used. I think it's illogical argument, but the same argument is used in terms of this notion of the state or other third parties being better positioned than the pregnant person to protect the interests of potential life. And so I think with that short introduction, we could just dive in, don't you think, Kendall?
I think that sounds good. We're really excited to bring to you this Know Your Birthrights Hospital Adventure. This was an idea that our student organizers brought to life. They were like, what if we had to choose your own adventure? What if we really kind of had to have this experience of going through a hospital birth and seeing, kind of having a test of what your rights are. So the way we have this kind of thought out is that I'm going to be reading the narrative, and then we'll pause, and there will be this question about rights. And kind of think about putting yourself in this person's shoes and thinking, well, what are my rights? Because in that moment, you don't really have a lot of time to go and research and call people. And it's really in that moment kind of almost a gut reaction of, do I have this right? Also, what does it mean to have a right? Is it something I point to in the law, like in a law book, or is it something that is a human right? Like inherently I'm born and I have this right. And so let's go ahead and get started. You arrive at the hospital and are taken to your delivery room. While laboring at home, you discovered that drinking some water, nibbling on a poppy seed bagel, and walking around helped you get through your contractions. You want to continue doing this. Shortly after being admitted, the nurse comes in and tells you to lie down on the bed. She wants to hook you up to a fetal heart monitor. You don't want to be hooked up to the machine because it will significantly limit your movement. Do you have the right to labor in the way that works for you? So that is the first question. And so in the chat, if you could either respond yes, no, or I don't know.
What I love about starting off with this question is it allows us to get into some of the nitty-gritty right off the bat. So generally, yes, but in the United States, there hasn't really been any case law to establish this. So it's more of a presumed right that is based on certain principles that exist in our Constitution and other case law. For example, every state has really well-developed case law around the idea of informed consent in healthcare. And so the principle of being able to labor in the way that works for you is related to that informed consent notion. And it's also related to ideas of privacy that are established through the Constitution, and then sort of some of those enumerated rights that are retained by the people. So again, when it comes to just sort of the question of rights during labor and birth, many of them fall into this gray area where it's just that we don't have a lot of precedent to point us in the direction of what the right really is. Partly that's because people haven't had the opportunity to litigate these issues. There's not a lot of case law. And certainly there's no US Supreme Court case that's specifically on this issue. But for the purposes of our choose your own adventure, we're going with a simple yes.
Fantastic. So in this sense also, it would not be ridiculous to say, I want to labor in the way that works for me. That is not something that is out of the question. Like that's something that you could reasonably do.
You could. What you would encounter, though, is just people who are used to doing their job in a certain way. So you might encounter what feels like resistance because it would just be unusual. And then people experience that resistance different ways. It may feel like you're being told no, or you're being, kind of even shunned or mistreated by the providers if you do things that are different than what they're used to. And
Anna,
go
for it. I was going to say that Anna just popped in the chat to say that most of the time it's also based on the hospital protocol.
Exactly. That's one of the most interesting things. The majority of the people in the United States birth in hospitals. That is, of course, not necessarily true all over the world and hasn't always been true for humans, of course. But as a result, it means that most of the time when people are laboring, they're interfacing essentially with a private corporation. And in this country, the laws that protect the autonomy of private corporations are really strong. And there are strong individual rights, constitutional rights for people, but those can be kind of at odds when it comes to the issues we're talking about today.
So then we continue. You tell the nurse, no, I don't want to be hooked up to the machine. I want to be able to walk around. You give a no, a hard no. Do you have the right to say no and be heard? What do y'all think in the chat?
This one for me is easy because you can certainly say a lot of things, and there's certainly strong protections around what you say. Now, of course, mandating that you be heard, no, you can't really ensure that anybody's going to hear you, especially in this scenario. One of the things that I can tell you certainly happens is that if you say that really strong no, the staff may feel frustrated. They may feel angry with you. They may feel like you're giving them a hard time. You don't know what kind of shift they've had, and it would not be unusual at all if that no in that moment is responded to with all kinds of pushback. I mean, you could certainly say no, and then they could say a lot of things, as we'll see in the story as it evolves. But part of what we found over the years is that people don't even know when they can say no. And so to bring better balance to our system, I think it's important for people to find those places and know when they can feel empowered and sort of entitled to say no. And this is a place where you can say no. Essentially, that electronic fetal monitor is a medical intervention. You're entitled to informed consent, which includes your refusal. And I have to say, just as a side note, that electronic fetal monitor was implemented widely before it was ever tested. And it's since been demonstrated to be very ineffective. In fact, it was marketed as a tool that would predict and prevent cerebral palsy, and it fails to do that the majority of the time. In fact, it is wrong on that 98% of the time. So in terms, who would say yes to a medical intervention that is so ineffective?
Well, why do we use something that's it's wrong in predicting something 98% of the time?
It's become part of hospital protocol. So it's kind of like how the whole labor and delivery unit is constructed now and how it operates. It relies on essentially the ability to remotely keep tabs on how folks are doing. Obviously, it's an imperfect way of doing that, but I think, you know, the system relies on it. Nurses rely on it. And the OBs rely on the fact that nurses are relying on it. And then it's also useful as essentially a paper trail in the case of anyone being sued. And obstetricians are sued more than other specialists. And so, you know, the whole system relies on this paper trail too. You know, the medical liability insurance companies rely on this paper trail. You know, there's been work by excellent advocates to try and shed light on the fact that this tool doesn't exactly do what it says it was supposed to do and shouldn't be relied upon so much. But you know, once an entire system invests so heavily in a certain kind of technology, it's hard to disconnect it.
And Deborah has a follow-up question, and I feel like you touched on this a bit. Could you say to the nurse, I know what you've been told, but I know I have the right to say no, and I hope you'll support me?
Yeah, I think something along those lines. Certainly acknowledging the humanity of the providers that you interface with is going to help, and also personalizing, you know, helping your humanity be brought to the surface can help. In the birth rights guide that we'll share with you, we discuss a lot of different strategies, and at the end of the day, it's going to take a lot of different strategies because everybody's scenario is unique, and sort of the culture of each place and each person, it has to be factored in.
So the nurse tells you, you know, we're understaffed, so you need to put on the fetal heart monitor so I can keep an eye on you from my station. Tell me in the chat, do you have the right to demand to be transferred to a hospital that is not understaffed? We're getting some yeses, we're getting some nos, we're getting some I don't knows. We have some you have the right to leave at any time.
Yeah, I mean, I think your answers reflected the complexity of this one. You know, no. In the United States in particular, there's no recognized right to health or right to health care. That's just, we're a million miles from having that well supported in our legal system. And so in place of that, there are some things. There's a statute called EMTALA, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, but it only requires that hospitals that receive federal funding stabilize patients who are experiencing an emergency or labor. And stabilizing just means, you know, treating them until, in the case of labor, until birth. But that doesn't mean treating them in any particular way. It doesn't mean treating them well. It doesn't mean treating them in a way that honors their informed consent. And it certainly does not mean facilitating their transfer to another hospital. Now, a person could theoretically leave on their own, but sometimes people are in this position after they've had an epidural, so they've been numbed from the waist down, you know, strongly limiting their ability to actually on their own walk out. If they're supported, maybe they could be wheelchaired out, but I mean, just the logistics become really tricky. So one thing I recommend in the face of this complex reality is to be thoughtful about where you're going to give birth ahead of time. I mean, one of the nice things about pregnancy is you do have some lead time. You can usually see it coming. And so, you know, a lot of people they're constrained by what is covered by their insurance or, you know, who's in network. But even with that constraint, it's worth at least researching, finding out everything you can about your options, and then making choices based on, you know, some good information. That can be, you know, in New York State, hospitals are required to report various things, including their cesarean surgery rates. It varies so dramatically. Even within one city, even within a fairly small town, if you have two hospitals, they may have very different practices. So that's one thing, is just kind of see it coming and make a plan. Also knowing that despite the fact that the vast majority of people give birth in hospitals, there are alternatives, including home births and birth center births,
which we are going to talk about in our next webinar. It's going to be really exciting, so tune in then. So then the nurse fails to mention that they have a mobile fetal heart monitor available because it has not been charged or used in weeks. So you say, I don't want this fetal heart monitor. They say, you need to have it. We're understaffed. It's the only way. But they fail to mention that they have an option that would allow them to be monitored, but also to be able to move. So the question is, do you have a right to know all of your options in a hospital? What do y'all think? Do you have a right to know all of your birthing options in a hospital? We're getting a strong yes. We're getting absolutely.
Yeah. And what I like about this one is this is one of the easiest. This is one of the strongest, most clear cut, so well developed in the law. Of all the things you have when you're getting, medical care, you have this thing called informed consent, which comes in two parts: information and then consent or refusal. You can't really consent or refuse something that you don't understand. And the law, to a large degree recognizes that there's a difference between the expertise that a provider has and the information that the person receiving care has, and that there needs to be some way of filling that gap. Providing information about alternatives is one of the ways. However, a lot of states use the standard that it's based on what a reasonable provider would want you to know. Only a minority of states use the standard of what a reasonable patient would want to know. So there's still a little discrepancy there. And again, coming back to that sort of idea of hospital policies and protocol, if you're working in a facility where it's just like, we literally never use the Doppler, the battery operated fetal monitor. It's just kind of human. Nobody may think to tell you of the existence of such a thing just because it's just not part of their daily life. It's just not in their minds. It's not like the standard is you have to go to the latest evidence-based journal articles or keep up to date on those journal articles or anything like that. So to some extent, we're still constrained by practice, by what the majority of people do.
So you compromise with the nurse. You agree to have the fetal heart manually checked every 30 minutes by a nurse instead of hooked up to a machine, which the nurses can track from their station. The nurse is not happy with you since you are, quote unquote, being difficult and unreasonable. You ask for food and she tells you that's not allowed if you aren't on the fetal heart monitor. Do you have a right to have food and water? What do y'all think? Is it, excuse me, of course I can eat what I want? Is it, no, I'm not allowed to eat? Or what even is this question? We went with, what even is this question?
I'd say even since I gave birth 17 years ago, the culture of birth has shifted to where it's much more common to expect that it's okay to have food and water during labor, but that was not that long ago. And I'm confident there are still hospitals in the country where it's really just not. It would be a weird request, believe it or not. Believe it or not. And you have to kind of know the history of perinatal health care in this country to appreciate where we've been. I mean, there was a period of time not too long ago, maybe some of your grandparents or great-grandparents experienced birth in this country when essentially people received this drug that made them not have any memory of birth, but didn't otherwise necessarily change birth. And so a lot of times people would be in a lot of pain. They would be lonely. They would be strapped to beds. And they would be essentially just left to their own devices, alone strapped to a bed. But, everyone knew they were sort of being liberated from the pain of childbirth. That was the concept. The name of the drug was twilight sleep is the popular name. Scopolamine, I believe, is the drug name. So then out of that, there was a movement toward changing, because some people, particularly spouses of people who had given birth, would sort of see that they had bruise marks. They're kind of like, what happened? And so a movement toward a more natural form of childbirth emerged. And even just the history of paternalism in healthcare, the idea that, doctor knows best, whatever the doctor tells you to do is what you do. So it's just taken a lot of time to shift, especially because medicalized hospital birth was a direct counter to midwife-led, primarily home birth, which is what humans had been doing for eons prior. And of course, during that time, eating and drinking was normal. So it was kind of like in response to that, this medicalization occurred. What do you think, Kendall? Did I cover that?
I think so. It's just so scary, or even just the idea. And, kind of also piggybacking off of that, Sam just dropped into the chat our new staff attorney at NAPW, and she said, a friend who was looking at giving birth soon is on, and said to her, I think the reality is that nurses will really look at everything in terms of, is it best for baby? And how are you going to argue against that? So if even someone were to argue, you can't have food and water because it's best for the baby if you don't, or you need to lie down on the hospital bed, it's best for the baby if you do. You need to have this fetal heart monitor and not move, it's best for the baby if you do. How can you address that or argue against that?
One of the things I really recommend, so I'm really glad we're doing this, is that people learn about birth before they're pregnant. Like well before. Of course, there were times when we learned about birth because we were there for many births in our community, and that happens less now, especially in this country. So I'd recommend if people, if friends, if sisters, whoever gets pregnant, use that as an opportunity to try and learn these things, because it's just different when you're the pregnant one. There's a big reason to just manage your stress when you're the pregnant one. And some people could be overwhelmed by all the information, all the things that can go wrong. But I think people are best positioned to address these complexities when they are well educated. And, then you can kind of let the nurse's comments about what's good for the baby roll off your back. Because and you've made some decisions about how to navigate complexities. Because of course, with any information, but I think especially sort of information about our bodies, it's not just about the evidence, but it's then about what we value, what's important to us. So that it's never singular. It's not like, I just don't think there's a black and white. This is, there's a handful of things when it comes to pregnancy and birth where it's just pretty dramatically universally agreed. But otherwise, there's some judgment calls to be made. And it's kind of the beginning of parenting, to be able to start figuring out what kind of parent you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So we say you do have the right to have food and water. We're going back to our scenario.
I think, by the way, that could be a good question to ask in, early on in trying to find a provider.
Yeah.
If I sign up with you, are you the kind of provider that would allow me to have food and water during labor? That will be very informative.
Yeah, absolutely. So then a doctor you have never met before comes in and starts talking to the nurse. He asks the nurse why you aren't hooked up to the machine, and then hastily instructs you to scoot down and open your legs as he continues talking to the nurse. Not you. The doctor does not introduce himself or explain what they are about to do. Without warning, he spreads your legs and sticks his fingers into your vagina and breaks your water with a sharp hooked tool. You go quiet, shocked and unsure about what you go quiet. You are shocked and unsure about what just happened. You make eye contact with your doula, reach out to hold her hand and quietly ask, is this normal? Your doula takes your hand and asks you loudly, would you like the doctor to introduce himself and ask permission before touching you? You nod. The doctor looks up sheepishly and quickly apologizes. Sorry, I'm just a resident. Your doctor is running late and has asked me to make sure your water had broken. Does this really happen, Indra? What's going on here? So this question is, do you have the right to not be touched? But can you also address, like, do people not introduce themselves and just touch you without asking? Do they just break your water without asking? Do they not talk to you and just talk to the nurse? But yeah, the question is, do you have the right to not be touched?
As you're answering, first of all, yes, unfortunately, this really does happen. Not uncommonly. It's kind of culturally in the same family as people coming up to pregnant people and just touching pregnant people, or offering unsolicited advice to pregnant people. There's a way where the boundaries unfortunately really shift when it comes to pregnancy. And absolutely, and I get it. This resident literally was told, just go in there and do a thing. And if the resident's never trained, this is how you show some humanity. The resident not only will fail to show humanity a lot of the times, and then continue that practice. They'll train other residents to act in that way. So yes, unfortunately, this happens. It happens. It's very hard to keep up with. It's kind of hard to even come in with a checklist or say, I want you to ask me this, that, and the other. You'll be surprised, all the things. And again, that can vary by birth setting. If you're in a setting like a birth center, of course, or your home, particularly, it's just less intervention oriented. So you will have less interventions, less things will be done to you without your even having a discussion.
I know what a home birth is. What's a birthing center?
So, and actually, there are things called freestanding birth centers, and those are even distinct from what hospitals often call a wing of a hospital. Sometimes those are called birth centers or birthing centers, maybe because of the decor. It may have decor that's kind of more home-like, but if it's owned by a hospital and part of in the same building as a hospital, it's really not. It's maybe a maternity unit. But a freestanding birth center is independently owned. It's not part of a hospital, and that's what they do there. They just have people come and give birth. Usually people have their separate rooms. It's generally considered a home-like environment, and it's very low intervention, often midwifery led.
So I think everyone said, yes, you have the right to not be touched.
Yeah, and this one is well established in our legal system as well. This brings up another interesting point. So there's a difference sometimes between the rights that you conceptually have and then the rights that you can seek redress for, or that you can say something about if it goes wrong. And when it comes to not being touched, that's not only a right that we have in concept and principle, but it's also something that you can get redress for, that you can actually file a lawsuit about. And that is generally called battery. So battery is something that's both criminal and civil. So when it's criminal, only police can press charges, only the district attorney can initiate a case. But you could also file a private individual lawsuit essentially for an unconsented touch. And that could be from a medical provider. It could be from somebody on the subway. The tricky obstacle, though, when it comes to medical providers is that fuzziness of consent. You will have signed forms by the time at this juncture in our story, we've already been admitted to the hospital. You have essentially given consent to something. And a lot of times it's contested, There's a case, if we have time, that we can talk about it, that National Advocates for Pregnant Women has been working on for years. that gets into this fuzziness of what have you consented to when you've signed those forms upon admission.
So the doctor leaves, and when the doctor leaves, you tell the nurse you do not want that doctor conducting any more examinations. You feel that was horrible, you felt violated, you felt stressed, you didn't like anything about it. The nurse explains that that resident is the best in the hospital and you are lucky to have him, hands down. Question is, do you have the right to change doctors, midwives, or nurses? What do y'all think? We're getting lots of yeses, and we said, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this again is I'll give it a soft yes with a lot of complications. Again, logistically at this stage, it's going to be really hard. A lot of times, again, speaking of that private corporation, the hospital has made their staffing decisions. You know, they're operating this unit in the way that they've decided to operate it. So it may be that there isn't someone else. A lot of times the person you've seen for your prenatal care is not the same as the person that you see during your birth. So theoretically, yes, because, you know, essentially it's just you're asking them for something. You don't have to get it from them. But logistically, it's you're in a very tricky situation, especially in this moment. You're in labor. It's, again, this is why I really strongly encourage people to learn as much as they can before this moment, because this moment is easier prevented than addressed.
I feel like that's a very common theme. It's prevent yourself from going to a place that is scary rather than trying to deal with the hospital corporation once you are inside.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the other thing I'll just mention, which is the thing I love and that is also tricky about labor and birth, is that it's actually not a medical thing. Mm-hmm. You don't actually even need the supervision, you know, of an obstetrician or a specialist. It's just also this unique physiologic process that can sometimes go wrong. Just like being alive is a physiologic process that can kind of take many paths. And it's at those points, you know, where essentially people go from being involved in a healthy physiologic process to needing medical intervention that makes it complicated. But I've actually known of people who have been in a hospital and who have said, leave me alone. I don't want any of you here. They have even put themselves in the bathroom and then had Child Protective Services called on them for refusing medical support while they were laboring alone in the hospital. So these are tricky, tricky things.
So then, and you talked about this a little bit, you learn that your doctor is not on call and that you will have someone else on their team. Very likely someone that you have never met, that the doctor has never mentioned, because teams can be big. So you have this person is going to be with you while you are in delivery. Question is, do you have a right to demand the doctor you've been seeing during your pregnancy? This person has been on this path with you for the past 9-ish months. What do y'all think? Do you have that right? Do you not? Or you don't know? We have some I don't knows. We have a no. We said, nah.
Yeah, this is definitely more of a no. In terms of how the law in particular regards that relationship between a doctor and a patient, it's voluntary on both fronts. Doctors are not, it would be negligent for a doctor to abandon a patient at a certain place. They have some like ethics of practice rules that would require them to give a patient some notice and some time if they were to fire a patient, essentially. But a patient doesn't have those same constraints. A patient could fire their provider. But that is not, you know, the corollary is not that you can then force a provider to care for you. That is just not supported in law. There's also this thing of hospital admitting privileges. We could spend a whole webinar on that, but basically it's theoretically possible that you could have a provider, maybe a midwife, a community midwife, who you really want with you, but they don't have admitting privileges in the hospital. So the hospital could say to the provider, too bad, you go away. You're not welcome to practice here. So there's also that layer. I also wanted to know, Kendall, somebody had asked a question in the chat about the informed consent forms.
Yes.
Do you think now's a good moment to answer that?
I feel like we have a question later, but
I know.
yeah, for now. Yeah. We'll address it again.
Yeah. So first of all, if you can get a hand, you know, one of the doulas said, could they get that consent form and go over it with their clients in advance? If you can, absolutely, you should. That's the kind of thing, I think it's great. And that's one of the things I know from my midwife. I gave birth at home. She went over all those kinds of things with me well before labor, months before. And I really appreciated that. You know, you can just have plenty of time to think about it. But the other thing to know, actually, and this is well established in the law, is that a consent form is not the same as consent. Informed consent is a process. It's an evolving process. If you give consent, you can take it back. You can change your mind. And certainly the process of informed consent is expected to be verbal. The forms are supposed to be the recording of the process. They're not supposed to replace the process.
So if someone said, you need to go to surgery, sign this, and you sign it, that's not doing due diligence. That's
exactly. So, I mean, one thing you can do is before signing, you know, ask for that process. Like, I actually have questions, you know, I haven't gotten all the information, so I don't want to sign this until I get all the information. Of course, it could be hard, just like it's hard, you know, online when you're saying, yes, you're accepting terms and conditions. When you're in labor, you're inclined to accept the terms and conditions. You've got, you know, other things you're worrying about. But again, that's why it's helpful if you can think about it in advance, see it in advance. But even still, those forms do not replace your process, and you can change your mind and you can take it back. You could even say, if you've changed your mind or take it back, please note this in my chart. I've changed my mind. Or make sure and say in my chart that I've, you know, asked for another doctor. Even if they don't honor that, I think it can be helpful to sort of empower yourself and advocate for yourself.
So the doctor comes in, your doctor comes in and warmly welcomes you and asks you, how are you doing? They listen actively and then ask if they can touch you before checking how far dilated you are. They ask if you want a spinal block and respect when you say you do not. They then tell you that the OR should be ready soon. You're confused. You remind him that your birth plan includes you giving birth vaginally. The doctor regretfully tells you that you aren't progressing fast enough and that you will need a cesarean surgery. Do you have the right to refuse a cesarean surgery? What do y'all think? Yes, of course, I hope so. We aren't living in Gilead yet. Are we? No, you must do whatever the doctor says, hashtag under his eye. Or I don't know what is going on. We have yes to an extent. Yes, if it's not an emergency. No, if you're in trouble, if it isn't medically indicated. You can refuse unless it's medically an emergency. Yes, but they can overrule you. Indra, what is the answer?
I really like this one because the answer is yes, but we're not living in Gilead yet, are we? So again, we don't have U.S. Supreme Court level rulings on this precise issue. And as a result, we see providers and hospitals and courts making decisions on this question that are all over the map. Unfortunately, there have been some tragic cases. One that an APW worked on many years ago at the beginning involved forced cesarean surgery on a woman who was a cancer survivor whose cancer had returned during her pregnancy. and she was fairly early in the pregnancy. So it wasn't clear that a cesarean surgery would even save the fetus and that it could end her life. They proceeded with the unconsented surgery, and both she and the fetus died. So ultimately, an appeals court said that that was wrong to give her the surgery without her consent, but they had already done it. And that, unfortunately, is something that we've seen in other cases too. Again, bringing up that difference between having a right in principle and being able to get redress, much less being able to sort of block something from happening. Those who raised in the chat the idea of medical necessity, I would challenge to think about the implications. If you're a conscious human being, and you're saying, based on the information that you have, that you do not want this surgery, and maybe a gentle, lovely doctor like this one who speaks to you respectfully and seems to regard you as a human, tells you, well, we believe it's necessary. Usually it's necessary to save the fetus. But if you're the parent of that soon-to-be little baby and you disagree, I can't quite wrap my mind around the kind of world we would live in if we were okay with doctors overriding the decision of those conscious people. Somebody's mentioning when it's a true emergency. I mean, the law certainly provides for, if you have a patient needing emergency care in general, not just in pregnancy, a person needing emergency care who can't consent for themselves because of maybe the nature of their injuries, maybe they're unconscious. Then we have proxy decision makers. We have procedures and steps that we follow. There's no reason that shouldn't also be applied in the case of pregnancy. But if you're conscious, you're still there, you're still capable of making decisions. The bulk of our legal principles are oriented towards a conscious person should make decisions. We do have a United States Supreme Court case on the question of whether you can refuse for yourself life-saving medical treatment. And the answer is yes, you can refuse life-saving treatment. You essentially have that right to determine your life. But again, that case was not in the context of pregnancy, which is just honestly different. And Kendall, we could talk about Renat Dre's case, but here we are running out of time.
I know. One more thing I will say that I bring up a lot is the interesting concept of how we think of pregnant people versus fetuses versus people, and how the value gets very shifted. And so like if you have a baby that's born and it's 3 hours old and it will die if it does not get part of its dad's liver. We don't have any kind of, it's an emergency, dad, you have to sacrifice part of your body, even if it's just like you can donate part of your liver while you're
right.
You can be a living donor. It's going to save this child's life, and if you don't do it, it's going to die. This alive child with all of its rights will die. You can't force him to give up that organ and to go under surgery. In fact, if there's a dead guy at the hospital, perfect organs, and he did not sign a consent form saying you can have them, you cannot touch him, and doctors don't, and like at all. Like it would be really weird for a doctor to be like, I'm just gonna scoot around and just like grab this liver. Like you do not. And so that means that we as a nation respect the rights of a dead man more than a living pregnant person, and that we give more rights to a fetus than we do a person. And so that like shifts, and it's also really scary. It's quite easy to say this is an emergency, therefore do what I say. Now you have rights.
Yeah, and just to even humanize that, on the surface you might be like, wow, why would that dad not want to give his liver to his little baby? But people have reasons. Like one of the most compelling, I think, is just religious reasons. Certainly some religions have prohibitions against certain kind of medical intervention. And if not prohibitions, then, philosophies against, or even just a philosophy of of, faith that, a higher power will or will not intervene. And just so using the power of the state essentially to make that decision for somebody, I think we lose some things as humans when we do that.
So the next question is, at that moment, the resident from before comes back in to start preparing you for surgery. You ask him to leave. Really quickly, do y'all think we have the right to ask people to leave? Is it a yes? Is it a no? Is it a I do not know? We said yes.
Yeah, this one's a little more straightforward again. Even though you're in this corporation's facility, you can request your privacy.
That's all about the privacy. So the doula repeats your wishes for the resident to leave out loud, which is a tool doulas can do to elevate the wishes of the person who's giving birth. Doctor gets irritated and jokingly reminds the doula, "You're not the doctor, I am," and warns your doula that they need to calm down or they will have to leave. Do you have a right to a doula or other support person to be present? What do y'all think? Yes, no, I don't know. Do you have a right to have a doula or other support person present? We're seeing lots of yeses.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news on this one. But no, this right has not been established. And some of the interesting legal history is that in the 70s, there were some cases brought by fathers who, up to that point, were not commonly allowed to be at labors. And so those cases essentially asked this question: hey, don't I have a right? So it wasn't even quite the question of does the pregnant person have a right to support, but does a family member have a right to be there? And none of those cases won. There was never a precedent establishing a right for fathers to be at the labor of at the birth of their babies. So there's no supporting law or principle on this matter. What I do think is interesting about this issue, though, is that what has shifted is culture has shifted. People's expectations have shifted to where mainly most everywhere prior to the pandemic, it was just assumed, of course, people would and could and should have a support person with them. The pandemic, I think, had illustrated the fact that this right is not well established. And so actually, I think we're probably in an interesting moment of this issue being readdressed with the fact that New York State, for example, there were strong messages from the governor that support was expected. It doesn't quite establish a right or a law, but I think it kind of takes this issue to the next level. Hopefully moving toward yes.
Wouldn't that be nice? So you ask your doctor why he doesn't want to give you more time. He explains that the baby is too big and that you won't be able to give birth the way you planned. Still, he reassures you that after he performs a quick cesarean surgery, you will have a happy and healthy baby. And isn't that all that matters? You feel your heart start to race. You think, that's not all that matters. What about your own health and well-being? The resident notes that the baby's heart is racing and is irregular and states that you should probably go into surgery now. You ask for 5 minutes to calm down and request to see the fetal heart rate tracings to try and buy yourself some time. The nurse tries to calm you down, but also attempts to reason with you by saying, "We like live babies here, so we need to go ahead and do the surgery now. Okay, Mom?" You feel in immediate danger and consider leaving the hospital. Indra, would a nurse ever say that? Would a nurse ever say, "We like live babies here"?
Absolutely. I have heard this myself. It's very, very powerful and hard.
And it sounds effective. The question is, do you have a right to leave the hospital while in active labor? What do y'all think? We have no, we have some yeses, and I don't know. We have another no. Yeah. We have that, right?
Yeah, and this one is another really, really strong principle in our laws. It's considered one of the more extreme things to confine, to detain, or even to incarcerate a person, especially without due process. So absolutely, you can leave. Again, logistically, it could be tricky. I think, this character has consented to this. No, she refused the spinal block. So she theoretically could get up and walk out. She will get the feeling that she can't, but she can.
So the nurse overhears you talking about leaving and says, if you leave now, it will be AMA, which is what another doula in the chat said. So against medical advice. And your insurance won't pay. That's a scary tactic. If you leave AMA against medical advice, can your insurance refuse to pay? What do y'all think? Your insurance is like, we already covered admitting you and giving you these intro drugs and giving you XYZ. Again, this is so scary. Like, what do you do in the moment? Call your insurance company and say, hey, will you cover this? Oh my gosh. We're getting a lot of I don't knows and yeses and probablys. Indra, you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, mainly this is used as a threat. It's used coercively to get people, again, to feel like it's not an option, but it really is an option. There's no basis for insurance companies refusing to pay for. Also, the way that maternity care is billed, it would be complicated. But no, they can't refuse. And don't believe them when they tell you this. Don't let it be your barrier to defending yourself, to standing up for your needs.
So then the follow-up question is, if you go to another hospital, do you have the right to be admitted? What do y'all think? Yes? No? I don't know. Ooh, we're getting some yes if you're in active labor. Yes, exclamation point. Lots of yeses. We feel, oh, yes, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And this gets back to that law I mentioned earlier, EMTALA, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. Yes, you do actually have to be in active labor. There's a little fuzziness about when that is, but at this stage, it sounds like she's in active labor. So under a federal statute, she would have the right to be admitted elsewhere.
And which president brought us EMTALA? Anyone want to guess in the chat? Indra, you know, right?
I don't actually.
Oh, shoot. I thought you told me it was Reagan. Yeah, I thought it was Reagan. I told the student organizer.
Yeah, I know it's not a very old law.
Yeah. It was someone that I was like, really? I'll double check and tell you all in the follow-up email. So you firmly tell the doctor that you do not consent to a cesarean surgery yet. You haven't ruled it out, but you just haven't consented yet. You ask to see any hospital policy surrounding your rights as a person giving birth. The doctor tells the nurse to take you off the pit and to look into the hospital policy about maternal refusals. He then announces that he will be back in 20 minutes. He smiles and jokes that if you aren't dilated enough by then, it will be his turn to try and get that baby out. Again, do people really say this? Do they really just say like, oh, it'll be my turn and you get 20 more minutes? That's
yes.
it.
Absolutely. Yes.
Oh, and then your partner enters the room, breathless. He got to the hospital as soon as he could. He smells faintly of weed, and the nurse rolls her eyes when he comes into the room. Nice of you to show up, Dad. The nurse sniffs the air and suddenly becomes very short with you. She starts asking if you've been taking drugs while pregnant and tells you, I hope you brought formula because you won't be breastfeeding this baby. She then mentions that she will need you to pee in a cup before you go into surgery. Annoyed, you ask if it's for a drug test. She says it's protocol. You refuse the urine test. Do you have the right to refuse a drug test? Yes? No? I don't know. What do y'all think? Ooh, we're getting some strong yeses. Tell us, Indra.
So again, based on the principles of informed consent, you absolutely have a right to refuse a drug test. It's an intervention, it's voluntary. Again, in this situation, it's voluntary. There's some employment contexts, some other legal contexts that might not be voluntary, but yes. However, huge caveat on this one. If you refuse, it increases the chances that the providers will be suspicious. And if the providers are suspicious that you're using drugs or used drugs during your pregnancy, they could then report to child welfare, child protective services. And that sort of suspicion then can kind of tip the scales depending on who you are. Certainly your race or skin color, whether your payor is Medicaid or private insurance, whether you have a partner there, whether you're young. All kinds of factors can then tip the scales to, oh, you've declined a drug test and da 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 da, and then it can certainly cause more problems, even if you are then forced to have a drug test, and even if the drug test is negative. But unfortunately, in this case, we know our character was nibbling on a poppy seed bagel. It's actually possible that she could test positive. Drug tests aren't as reliable as, we would kind of hope or want them to be, and as some people treat them to be, especially the initial drug tests. Legally, to be used as evidence, drug tests should have a confirmation, which is like a higher, more sophisticated type of test. But this person, she could refuse, she could then be forced, or they could, kind of unconsentedly take a test, and she could test positive because of the poppy and the poppy seed bagel.
Follow-up question, can they call child protective services?
Absolutely. And it happens not infrequently. The majority of kids who are in foster care are actually infants under the age of 1. And so a lot of that intervention happens in this moment. This is that moment where the Child Protective Services investigation begins, essentially.
And, just so we're here, and I don't think we're going to have time to do the second half of this, and we're going to have to wind down soon, but I'm just going to open a huge can of worms and say, if someone's using drugs while pregnant, shouldn't they have their kids taken away? Isn't that really bad for the fetus? And therefore, they should call Child Protective Services. Or am I completely wrong?
I'm afraid you're completely wrong, Kendall. There has not been rigorous evidence to suggest that there's a direct kind of harm based on substance use during pregnancy. I mean, there are, in fact, the substances that have the most tangible harm are the legal ones, like nicotine and alcohol.
Wait, but what about the crack baby myth? I heard a lot about that. It was very scary, shaking babies. Like,
yes.
That can't be good.
Well, it was one of those things where a worried doctor started doing some research and kind of put the cart before the horse, started anticipating findings before he actually had findings. And actually, he has recanted his early stance with regard to the impact of cocaine prenatally. It was ultimately unfounded. And the same is true with, the opioid epidemic. There's a similar sort of wave of hysteria and fear and sort of anticipating harms that aren't manifesting. One of the things we do see, an infant can be born with a chemical dependency. So that's where babies who are exposed to opioids prenatally, maybe because their parent is using methadone to treat their opioid dependency, that baby could have a physical dependency, but that is temporary and treatable. Usually the effects of that chemical dependence wane in a short period of time, not even a month.
Doesn't it make sense, though, called Child Protective Services? Because then it would tell someone, like, okay, maybe I shouldn't use drugs while pregnant. Like, that will really just nip that in the bud.
I can see the logic. It's just not borne out by reality, in that people experience Child Protective Services investigations as threatening. It actually drives people away from care. It actually prevents them from seeking help, needed help, wanted help. Basically, because what comes with Child Protective Services investigations is the power of the state to remove a child from their parents. It's a profound power. And people are right to be cautious and hesitant about that kind of power. And so it's not very well associated with actually connecting people with wanted and voluntary help.
Well, thank you for clearing that up. I'm sure we could have an entire webinar just on that in and of itself, because there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Preconceived notions. And I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We've gone over. So we need to come to an end, even though I really want to do and look at this video. So I am thinking, if you need to hop off, we will miss you. If you want to stay for this 7-minute video where we can, we've talked about this theoretical kind of winding through the hospital system and what that could look like. But we've been talking about someone inadvertently, Renat Dre, this case that NAPW has been working on for years. I've been organizing a lot around it. Just to hear from her, for her to tell her story. It's a recording, and it's really powerful. And to just talk about it for a little bit afterwards, and to also drop any other questions you may have for Indra. Please do use the Q&A so I can keep track of the questions, but if you have to go, we will miss you. If not, I'm going to try and switch to the video really quickly.
The ultimate goal, of course, is to overturn Roe. But doing so means that you are taking away a whole series of other rights from women. So women who want to carry a pregnancy to term, want to make choices about how they give birth, might lose those rights because the court may be able to decide that what they've chosen for their birth, for their pregnancy, is not in the best interest of the fetus.
There's a number of cases in which women have been either coerced into options they didn't want or didn't understand, or whose wishes have been simply ignored.
So Renat called me about being a doula for her for the birth of her third child. She was looking to have a vaginal birth after 2 prior cesareans, which is evidence-based, and there's no reason why not to encourage someone to at least attempt to do so. I suggested she might want to look into getting another care provider. Although her care providers had a reasonably high VBAC success rate, I knew from prior experience that they were not supportive, what we might call woman-friendly. Even though sometimes they got the job done, with a lot of collateral damage, emotional trauma, with a lot of pain.
Because I was in Medicaid, I did not have the choice to switch to a different doctor.
When we arrived in the hospital, the doctor on call was not immediately available. Renat this time definitely seemed to be in real labor and what I would call active labor. When the doctors showed up, she was again given the ultimatum, you can stay and have a C-section, or you can leave. These are your choices. Renat was in a tremendous amount of pain. It was clearly against everything that she wanted, and it was very hard to come to terms with. On one hand, do you stay and submit to the C-section that you don't want and medically right now don't need? Or do you leave, and if you leave, go where? Go where in the height of active labor?
After 2 hours, I was 6, dilated 6. So Shayna was there and my mother was there. And I was so happy. And Shayna was crying, and I was, wow, it's going to happen. What you wanted, and you're very happy. But then he came in. He came in and he said, don't be so happy. It's not going to happen. You're not going to have a natural birth.
The fact that she was pursuing a VBAC after 2 cesareans against his clinical judgment, his personal individual clinical judgment, was grounds enough for her being an abusive mother. He said things like, you're a bad mother for putting your baby at risk. We can call a court, we can call a judge and have you have a court-ordered C-section, that you have to do this for your baby's well-being. Meantime, he had not given her any information that her baby's well-being was actually some type of an issue.
If I would know that my baby was in danger, I would go for a C-section, of course.
He said, we can have a court-ordered cesarean to keep your baby from being subjected to your insistence on continuing to be in labor.
He said, if you're not going to sign for a C-section, we can take away your children. Just to press me, to scare me that I should sign the C-section. And he also came back put a glove on to check me. And then he just took off the glove. He said, no, I'm not going to check you. I'm not going to check how dilated you are unless you're signing for the C-section.
What happened was kind of the unbelievable. He brought in another physician. The two of them released the wheels of the bed. They rolled her out of the room. They rolled her down the hallway.
I was screaming, crying, but they didn't pay attention. They just kept rolling the bed into the operation room.
My jaw is dropping. She didn't sign anything. What's going on here? How can they just be rolling her down the hallway into the operating room?
But after a few minutes, while they taking the baby, taking care of him, the doctor screamed, urologist. And I still didn't realize why. Then after a little while, they asked Shayna to leave, and they said they asked to have a general anesthesia because the doctor cut my bladder. It was horrible to be treated this way. It was not only the fact he did a C-section, is all the way, how he was behaving, how he's using scary tactics, and what I was like, I didn't believe that something like that gonna happen to me in United States.
People have a misconception about what is taking place in the United States right now.
We definitely see women being prosecuted, women losing this bodily autonomy. It often happens in various isolated incidences. So it's hard to see sometimes that there is a larger trend, but there absolutely is a larger trend.
So obviously her experience just, addresses so many things that we've discussed in this webinar. Not the least of which is that question, that difference between, rights that we have in theory and what we can do if the rights are violated. She did eventually find a lawyer with NAPW's help, filed a lawsuit on the basis of a lack of informed consent. She filed this lawsuit 6 years ago now, and the case is still pending. So just on that level, that doesn't really feel like justice. That makes it feel like a very tenuous right. And frankly, as her case has proceeded, there have been many points at which the court has made decisions and rulings that have undermined that right. Not the least of which was the court's decision to throw out the informed consent claim itself, arguing that she should have filed a battery lawsuit. Interestingly, the statute of limitations for battery is just 1 year, whereas for malpractice, which is what she filed, is 2.5 years. So you can imagine being postpartum and having had a traumatic birth and having 3 kids. 1 year goes by very fast. So that in itself is a barrier to people even getting redress for this kind of harm. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so I kind of wanted to process even that video because it's a big video. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. And so I'm wondering if you all can respond in the chat. I kind of just want to talk about it a bit. And even just tell me, like, what did we just watch? Like, just very plain and simple, like, give me a sentence if you would. What did we just watch? Violation of human rights, a violent act in the form of surgery being forced on a woman, her rights being violated, abuse, total disregard of her choices. And then I also am curious if you could share, if you feel comfortable, what are some emotions that came up for you during this clip? So it can be a single word. What kind of emotions bubbled up for you while watching this clip? I see anger. I see fear. Anger, sadness, frustration, fear, anger, fear, maddening, injustice, anger, angry and feeling sorry for her, disgust. Absolutely. And then my third question is kind of like, so what do we watch? How do we feel about it? So what? Like, is it even important that we hear Renat Dre's story? And if so, why? Like, why are we taking the time right now during this webinar to listen to Renat Dre's story? And is it important that we hear it? It's important to hear it because if nothing is done, things will never change. We have to create change for every birthing person. Yes, it's important because it's just one of the many cases of abuse, violation of rights. Yes, women bring lives into the world. Yes, information to keep it from happening from the planet. Yes, very important, make aware of abuse. Yes, hopefully we can help someone in the future. Yes, it's important. It can help you stand up for yourself. I agree with all these things. So the last one's the biggest one in my opinion. It's now that you've heard Renat's story, what is something you plan to do differently in the future? We watched injustice, we felt angry, we value it, we think it's important. But now that you've heard Renat's story, what is something that you plan to do differently? Something concrete. Educate moms better on rights. Encourage parents with their rights. Encourage people to get more educated, to get a doula. That's a big one. Encourage lots of questions. Don't assume. Share the information. I feel like that has been a very common theme in this webinar, is to educate yourself, and then once you're educated, to educate others. Share stories, share facts, get the word out, incorporate the topics and stories into classroom settings at the university. Yes, Rachel. Be informed of the rights myself and let parents know they have choices for childbirth. Talk about it when you teach. Yes, Deborah. Which is cool because, like, you can do this in a classroom setting, you can do this in an informal setting, you can do this with your friends, you can do this if you're a high schooler, you can do this if you're at a college campus, you can do this if you never want to have kids in your life, you can do this if your greatest aspiration in life is to become a mom. Like, it's the whole spectrum of, if, 84% of half the population is going to give birth, that's a big issue. And we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it in sex ed. It kind of stops right there at birth control. Like, there's no talking about giving birth. There's no discussion about your birth rights. And so I think that is a big thing, is talking about it. And if while talking about it, you also want to do something, you can sign a petition demanding doctors respect the rights of pregnant people during all stages of pregnancy, labor, and delivery. You just have to go to bit.ly/NAPWDRAY, all caps. So please check that out, sign it, share it, post on your social media accounts, get the word out, and help us educate other people about what's going on in our hospital systems. You can also share some graphics that our student organizers made. And while I bring those up, Indra, is there anything that you want to say to kind of wrap this up? Some words of wisdom that we can really take to heart?
Well, as much as I dislike the story about fathers not ever winning any of those cases to have the right to be at the birth of their babies, I also love that story because it really shows the power of culture change, and the power of individual people just expecting something different. And that's one of the things that I think we can count on, is that when culture changes on these issues, the providers and facilities will follow. So even though it's scary and depressing information, I do continue to have a lot of hope that once people learn about these issues and decide to insist on having, the humanity of pregnant people honored at every stage, then I think we can expect it. I really do. So take heart. I know, believe me, I know it is hard to stomach this depressing information, but we are the ones, literally, those of us here today are the ones who can make a difference on this.
I want to give a big thanks to Samantha, Naharika, Maya, to Claire, to Emma, to Abby. This is just a small sample of the graphics that they've created, and we're going to send you a link to those as well. So if you're like, I want to get the word out, but I don't really know how to say an hour and a half of what Kendall and Indra just said in, 140 characters, we can help you with that. Some of these, you can swipe through and you can see like 10 of them, so it really tells a story. And then if you want to educate yourself even more, we have this beautiful birth rights guide I was talking about that talks about knowing your birth rights. And that's really just kind of what we talked about today. It also talks about what to do during a violation, what to do after a violation, moving towards birth justice and other resources. And we're going to make sure that we send that out to you as well. And it has, if you're a doula or if you're a birthing person or if you want to support someone, it has like these graphics that can kind of be almost like a little bit of a mantra, like I do have the right to have my basic needs met, or to not be touched, or to ask people to leave. We went through some of these today. And, it also educates yourself to remind yourself that there are barriers faced by pregnant and laboring people that you may not even think about, like being in foster care, experiencing violence, and kind of help you shape how you walk through the world, or think about how you walk through the world and walk through those hospital doors, but also how other people do as well. And then also, again, centering what you can do during a violation so that if this does happen, you have some tools to help get through it or to help someone else get through it. And if you are interested also in becoming a NAPW volunteer student organizer, let me know. Respond to the email that you'll get that, hey, this sounds really cool, or I want my students to get involved, and we can be in touch. But other than that, I think that's all I have to say. Yeah.
We've certainly said a lot.
We have said a lot. Thank you all so much for joining. Next month, it's going to be, we've talked about hospital births. What about kind of the history of what home births and why I moved to the hospital? Indra was talking about that a little bit, but then also what does a home birth look like today? Like, what are my kind of other options, and what could the future look like? Thank you all so much. Hope to see you later.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.